June 8, 1945. 7:23 a.m. Queen Alexandra Military Hospital, Portsmouth. The ward smelled of carbolic soap and blood, of bandages boiled clean and wounds still weeping. Sister Margaret Hoffman stood in the doorway, her hands clasped at her waist, her spine rigid, her eyes fixed on the rows of beds stretching toward tall windows that leaked morning light. She had been ordered to report here at 700 hours. She had been told nothing else. For 3 weeks, since her capture near Bremen, she had existed in a state of suspended animation, transported, processed, housed in a holding facility with 17 other German nurses, all of them waiting for the punishment they had been taught was inevitable. A British matron approached, her uniform starched to mathematical precision, her face weathered but not unkind. She carried a clipboard and a fountain pen and the expression of someone who had managed crisis so long that routine had become her only religion. She stopped 2 feet from Margaret and said, in careful German, "Sister Hoffman. You worked in field hospitals." "Yes, Orthopedics? Surgery?" "Both. For 3 years." The matron nodded, made a notation, and then gestured toward the ward. 38 beds. 26 occupied. Most are surgical cases, amputations, shrapnel wounds, burn trauma. You will work under Sister Davies, there. She pointed to a British nurse adjusting a drip stand near the far wall. You will follow her instructions. You will treat patients with the same standard of care we demand of all staff. Do you understand? Margaret stared. She had expected interrogation. She had expected a labor camp, a punishment detail, months of scrubbing floors while British soldiers jeered. She had not expected this. You want me to announce? That is your training, is it not? Yes, but. Then you will nurse. The matron's tone was clipped, final. The patients do not care what uniform you wore. They care that you are competent. Are you competent, Sister Hoffman? Margaret's throat tightened. Yes, Good. Report to Sister Davies. She will orient you to procedures. The matron turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. You are not a prisoner here. You are a nurse. Act accordingly. She walked away before Margaret could respond. Margaret stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the contradiction. Not a prisoner. A nurse. The words did not reconcile. She had surrendered. She had been defeated. She was the enemy. And yet, she was being asked to heal. They expected chains. The first word they heard was competent. And the first task they received was to save lives, British lives, using the same hands that had tried to save German soldiers dying for a cause now revealed as ash. The moment stretched. Margaret forced her legs to move, walking toward Sister Davies, who looked up from the drip stand and offered a brief, professional smile. You're the new German nurse, then? She said in English. Margaret nodded, though she understood only half the words. Davies switched to halting German. Follow me. I show you supplies, routines, patients. They moved through the ward together, Davies pointing at cabinets stocked with bandages, syringes, morphine ampoules, surgical instruments gleaming in trays. She explained meal schedules, medication rounds, documentation procedures. Her tone was brisk, matter-of-fact, as if training a colleague rather than supervising an enemy. At one bed, she paused beside a young soldier, 19, maybe 20, his right leg ending in a stump wrapped in gauze. He was awake, staring at the ceiling, his face pale with pain or morphine or both. This is Private Jenkins, Davies said. Amputation 4 days ago. Watch for infection. Check drainage, change dressings twice daily, monitor for fever. She turned to Margaret. You have done this before? Yes, Margaret said quietly. Many times. Good. Davies handed her a chart. Then you begin now. Margaret stood beside the bed, looking down at the young soldier, the enemy soldier, the man her country had tried to kill, and felt something crack inside her chest. She had spent 3 years treating German casualties, had learned to see wounds as problems to be solved, bodies as machines requiring repair. But this was different. This was care without ideology, healing without allegiance. This was medicine stripped of everything except its most essential truth. Suffering demands response, regardless of who suffers. She checked the dressing. The soldier flinched. She murmured an apology in German, then realized he would not understand. She said it again in English, the words clumsy but sincere. Sorry. I am careful. Jenkins looked at her, his eyes focusing slowly. You're German, he said, not a question. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My leg hurts." "I know. I will help." She changed the dressing with hands that had learned steadiness through repetition, through necessity, through 3 years of war that had taught her nothing except how to endure. When she finished, Jenkins closed his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. Margaret did not know what to say. So she simply nodded and moved to the next bed. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. Margaret Hoffman had been captured on May 3, 1945, in the final chaotic collapse of the Third Reich. Her field hospital, a collection of tents and requisitioned barns outside Bremen, had been overrun by British forces advancing through northern Germany. The commanding medical officer, an army surgeon too old for combat, had gathered the nursing staff in the courtyard at dawn and told them the war was over. "You will surrender with dignity," he said. "You are medical personnel. The Geneva Convention protects you. Conduct yourselves accordingly." They had walked toward the British lines with their hands raised, 23 women in soiled grey uniforms, exhausted, frightened, uncertain whether the convention meant anything to men who had just fought their way across a continent. The British soldiers who met them were young, wary, and surprisingly gentle. They searched the nurses, quickly, impersonally, and separated them from the male staff. An officer explained in broken German that medical personnel would be transported to holding facilities, processed, and eventually assigned work in British military hospitals. "You are nurses," he said. "We need nurses. It is that simple." It was not simple. Nothing about war was simple. But the British treated it as if it were, as if the machinery of occupation could be managed with the same bureaucratic efficiency they applied to supply chains and troop movements. The nurses were loaded onto trucks, driven west, and housed in a converted school near Osnabrück. They slept on camp beds, ate British rations, and waited. For 3 weeks, they existed in limbo, no longer German, not yet anything else, suspended in the space between defeat and whatever came next. Then came the transfer orders. 18 nurses were selected, those with the best English, the strongest medical credentials, the fewest ties to the Nazi Party. They were told they would be sent to England. To work. In hospitals. Caring for the wounded. The announcement was met with stunned silence. One nurse, a woman named Helga, had asked the obvious question, "Why would they want us?" The British officer had replied with bureaucratic bluntness, "Because we are short-staffed, and you are trained. Ideology is irrelevant to a man bleeding on a table." The crossing from Cuxhaven to Portsmouth took 14 hours. The ferry was a converted troop transport, its hold packed with supplies, its decks crowded with personnel returning from the continent. The German nurses sat in a section cordoned off by rope, guarded by 2 British soldiers who looked as uncomfortable with the arrangement as the prisoners felt. The sea was grey, the wind cold, the air thick with salt and diesel fumes. Margaret stood at the rail for most of the journey, watching the coastline recede, watching England emerge from the mist, green cliffs, white buildings, a harbour bustling with ships. She thought about the propaganda she had absorbed for years, the images of Britain as a dying empire, starving and desperate. But the harbour looked functional, orderly, untouched by the destruction she had seen in Germany. When they docked, the nurses were processed through customs with the same efficiency applied to military cargo. A Red Cross representative met them, a British woman in her 50s who spoke fluent German and explained that they would be housed in a hostel near the hospitals where they would work. "You will be paid a modest stipend," she said. "You will have access to canteens, libraries, recreational facilities. You will be treated as auxiliary staff, not prisoners. In exchange, you will work to the standard expected of all nursing personnel. Is this acceptable?" The nurses nodded, too bewildered to argue, too exhausted to ask questions. They were taken to the hostel, a brick building that had once been a boarding school, now converted to house displaced persons and temporary workers. The rooms were small but clean, with beds, wardrobes, wash basins. Margaret set her single bag on the bed and sat beside it, staring at the wall, trying to understand what was happening. She had expected punishment. She had received a job. The pivot came not in words but in action. On her second day at Queen Alexandra Hospital, Margaret was assigned to assist in an emergency surgery, a young airman whose bomber had crashed on landing, his abdomen torn open by shrapnel. The surgical team worked with frantic precision. A British surgeon, an anesthetist, 2 nurses, and Margaret, handed instruments and asked to anticipate needs she had learned to predict through repetition. The surgery lasted 3 hours. When it ended, the surgeon stripped off his gloves, glanced at Margaret, and said, "Good hands. You've done this before." "Yes, sir." Many times. German hospitals. Field hospitals. Eastern Front, Italy, France. The surgeon nodded, his face unreadable. Then he said, "We're all on the same side now. The side that tries to keep people alive." He walked out of the theater, leaving Margaret standing beside the operating table, her hands still trembling from adrenaline, her mind racing. We're all on the same side now. It was such a simple statement, such an impossible truth. She had spent 3 years on the opposite side, had treated soldiers fighting to destroy the very nation now employing her. And yet, here she was, covered in a British airman's blood, part of a team that had just saved his life. That evening, she wrote in her diary, a small notebook issued by the Red Cross, its pages blank and waiting. "I do not know what I am anymore. I am not a prisoner, but I am not free. I am not British, but I am no longer German. I am simply a nurse. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it has to be." The policy governing the employment of captured German medical personnel was rooted in pragmatism rather than mercy. By June 1945, British military hospitals were overwhelmed, thousands of casualties from the final campaigns, returning POWs suffering from malnutrition and disease, civilians injured in the bombing campaigns. The nursing shortage was acute. At the same time, Allied forces held thousands of trained German nurses, screened for war crimes, vetted for political affiliation, sitting idle in holding camps. The solution was obvious: put them to work. A directive from the War Office, dated May 15, 1945, outlined the framework. Captured medical personnel with verified training and no evidence of criminal activity could be employed in British hospitals under supervision. They would be paid a nominal wage, housed in auxiliary accommodations, and treated as temporary staff. The policy served 3 purposes. Practically, it addressed the staffing crisis. Strategically, it demonstrated Allied commitment to the Geneva Conventions and humane treatment of POWs. Morally, it upheld the principle that medical care transcended politics, that healing was a universal obligation, not contingent on nationality or ideology. Security, diplomacy, morality. The triad was inseparable. But for the nurses themselves, the policy was simply reality. They woke at 6, worked 12-hour shifts, and collapsed into bed too exhausted to question the strangeness of their circumstances. Daily life at Queen Alexandra Hospital settled into rhythms that felt surreal in their ordinariness. Margaret's shifts began with handover, reports from the night staff, updates on patient conditions, assignments for the day. Then rounds, checking vitals, administering medications, changing dressings, assisting with meals. The work was relentless but familiar, the routines identical to those she had followed in German field hospitals, the patients differing only in language and uniform. She worked alongside British nurses who treated her with varying degrees of warmth, some friendly, some distant, all professional. Sister Davies remained her primary supervisor, a woman who demanded competence but offered no judgment. When Margaret made a mistake, misreading a medication dosage due to unfamiliarity with British abbreviations, Davies corrected her firmly but without anger. "Double-check every order," she said. "Mistakes kill. We cannot afford them." Margaret learned to navigate the hospital's hierarchies, its unspoken codes, its peculiar British formality. She learned that tea was sacred, that matrons ruled with quiet authority, that doctors were addressed as sir regardless of rank. She learned the names of patients, their stories, their fears. Private Jenkins, the amputee, asked her once if she had family in Germany. She told him her parents were dead, her brother missing, her city destroyed. He said, "I'm sorry." She did not know how to respond to sympathy from the enemy, so she simply said, "Thank you," and moved on. 4 nurses carried the story forward, each embodying a different response to the impossible grace they had received. Margaret, 31, from Hamburg, remained wary. She worked with quiet efficiency, spoke only when necessary, and spent her evenings alone in her room, writing letters to addresses that might no longer exist. She could not reconcile the propaganda, the rhetoric of British cruelty, of enemy savagery, with the reality of Sister Davies patiently teaching her procedures, of patients thanking her for care, of a surgeon saying they were on the same side now. She wrote, "I am waiting for the cruelty to reveal itself. But each day it does not, I feel the ground beneath me shift. If they are not monsters, then what does that make us?" Helga, 26, from Berlin, was pragmatic. She had survived the war by focusing on immediate tasks, by refusing to dwell on abstractions like guilt or redemption. She worked in the burn ward, treating airmen whose faces had been melted by cockpit fires, whose hands were twisted claws of scar tissue. The work was brutal, but she approached it methodically, documenting progress, adjusting treatments, finding small victories in healing. "This is not forgiveness," she wrote. "This is simply work. But work, done well, might be its own form of penance." Ingrid, 29, from Munich, was the most shaken. She had believed deeply in the cause, had joined the Wehrmacht Medical Corps out of conviction rather than necessity. The collapse of the Reich had shattered her worldview, leaving a void she did not know how to fill. When a British patient, a sergeant who had lost both legs, told her she had kind hands, she broke down in the supply closet, weeping uncontrollably. Sister Davies found her, said nothing, simply stood beside her until the tears stopped. Later, Ingrid wrote, "I thought kindness was weakness. I was wrong about everything." And then there was Erika, 24, the youngest, from Stuttgart, who adapted with startling speed. She learned English quickly, made friends with British nurses, attended chapel services on Sundays. When asked by a patient why she worked so hard, she said, "Because I can. Because I am still useful. Because if I stop working, I will have to think about what we did. And I am not ready." She wrote, "The war taught me to follow orders. This hospital is teaching me to think. I do not know which is harder." The ideological shift was gradual, internal, built from contradictions too numerous to ignore. The nurses had been raised in a system that exalted the vogue, that defined worth through racial hierarchy, that taught them the Allies were degenerate, weak, unworthy. But the hospital contradicted every tenet. The British were disciplined, efficient, relentlessly professional. They treated German nurses as colleagues, not slaves. They saved lives with the same care regardless of whether the patient was British, Canadian, Polish, or even German. There were German POWs in the wards, wounded during capture, treated alongside Allied casualties. One afternoon, Margaret was assigned to care for a German prisoner, a young soldier, 17 at most, his chest shattered by shrapnel. He was dying. They all knew it. But the British surgeon operated anyway, spending 4 hours trying to repair the damage, and when the boy died on the table, the surgeon stood silent for a long moment, then said quietly, "He was someone's son." The word stayed with Margaret. He was someone's son. Not a statistic. Not an enemy. Just a boy. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe, the next scene will challenge you even more. A moment of transformation came in August, during a visit from a high-ranking British medical officer conducting inspections. He toured the wards, reviewed procedures, and then met with the German nurses in a small conference room. He thanked them for their work, acknowledged the strangeness of the situation, and then said something none of them expected: "You were lied to. By your government, by your leaders, by the propaganda that told you we were monsters. I will not ask you to forget what you believed. But I will ask you to remember what you have seen here. That we treated you as professionals. That we trusted you with our wounded. That we chose decency when we could have chosen revenge. Remember this. And when you return home, tell others." No one spoke. Finally, Helga asked, "Why? Why treat us this way?" The officer considered. "Because we believe that civilization is not what survives a war. It is what you carry through it. And if we abandoned that belief, we would have already lost." Christmas 1945 arrived cold and grey. The hospital organized a modest celebration, carols in the chapel, a special meal for patients, small gifts distributed by volunteers. The German nurses were invited to attend. They stood at the back of the chapel, uncertain, while a chaplain read from Luke, "Peace on earth, goodwill toward men." The irony was almost unbearable. But when the congregation sang Silent Night, first in English, then in German at the chaplain's request, Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. The song was the same. The melody transcended language, transcended war. For 3 minutes, they were not enemies. They were simply voices, singing together. After the service, a British nurse named Claire approached Margaret. "Happy Christmas," she said, and handed her a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a bar of soap, a tin of biscuits, and a handwritten note, "Thank you for your work. You make a difference." Margaret stared at the note, her vision blurring. She had expected nothing. She had received recognition. She had been seen not as a symbol of defeat but as a person who mattered. She whispered, "Thank you," but Claire had already moved on, distributing gifts to other nurses, German and British alike. Repatriation began in the spring of 1946. The nurses were given the choice: return to Germany or remain in Britain under work permits. Most chose to return, despite the ruins awaiting them, because home, however destroyed, was still home. Margaret was among them. She returned to Hamburg in April, found her apartment building gone, her street unrecognizable. She lived with a cousin, found work in a civilian hospital, and rebuilt her life one small decision at a time. But she carried the hospital with her. She kept her British nursing cape, folded in tissue paper, and her diary, and the note from Claire. She kept the memory of Sister Davies teaching her procedures, of the surgeons saying they were on the same side, of patients thanking her despite the uniform she had once worn. And when people asked her about the war, about captivity, about the British, she said simply, "They treated me as a nurse. Not as the enemy." And that made all the difference. Helga stayed in Britain. She married a Welsh doctor in 1948, moved to Cardiff, and spent 40 years working in the National Health Service. She became a British citizen in 1952, though she never lost her German accent. She told her children about the burn ward, about the patients she had treated, about the system that had trusted her when she had no reason to expect trust. "They gave me a second chance," she said. "I spent the rest of my life trying to deserve it." Ingrid returned to Munich, studied theology, and became a chaplain in a civilian hospital. She spent decades counseling patients and staff, offering the same quiet presence Sister Davies had offered her in the supply closet. She wrote a memoir in 1983, titled Healing the Enemy, in which she described her time at Queen Alexandra Hospital as the moment she learned that humanity was a choice, not a given. "They chose to see me as human," she wrote. "And in doing so, they taught me to see myself that way again." Erika immigrated to Canada in 1950, sponsored by a church group. She worked as a nurse in Toronto, raised 3 children, and lived until 2003. In her final interview, recorded by a local historian, she was asked what she remembered most about the war. She said, "The British hospital. The patients who thanked me. The nurse who gave me biscuits at Christmas. They did not have to be kind. But they were. And that kindness saved me." By 1947, over 300 German nurses had passed through British military hospitals, their service documented in personnel files, their contributions acknowledged in official reports. The program was quietly discontinued as staffing stabilized and repatriation accelerated. But the impact lingered, in the lives rebuilt, in the ideologies dismantled, in the small, stubborn insistence that even enemies could be treated with dignity. If this story has shown you something about the war you didn't know, subscribe and share, because the most powerful victories are won not on battlefields but in the quiet moments when we choose to heal rather than harm. June 8, 1945. 7:23 a.m. A German nurse stood in the doorway of a British military hospital, expecting chains and punishment and the brutal logic of defeat. Instead, she was handed a clipboard and asked a question, "Are you competent?" She was not offered mercy. She was offered work. She was not forgiven. She was trusted. And in that trust, provisional, conditional, earned through competence rather than absolution, she learned that the enemy she had been taught to fear was capable of restraint, that the civilization she had been told was dying was disciplined enough to treat prisoners as professionals, and that healing, in the end, required nothing more and nothing less than the decision to see suffering and respond. The propaganda had promised cruelty. The British offered a surgical theatre, a ward full of wounded men, and the expectation that she would do her job. They did not ask her to forget what she had done. They asked her to be useful. And in being useful, in changing dressings, administering morphine, holding the hands of dying boys who spoke a language she barely understood, she learned that redemption was not a gift. It was work. Hard, unglamorous, relentless work that saved no one from the past but might, eventually, build a bridge to the future. The war had taught her to serve a cause. The hospital taught her to serve the wounded. And in that shift, from ideology to action, from allegiance to care, she found not forgiveness but something more durable, the knowledge that even in the wreckage of everything she had believed, she was still capable of making a difference. They expected change. The first word was competent. And the first task was healing. And that was the war no one remembers, the one where enemies became colleagues, where competence mattered more than nationality, and where the hardest victory was won not through vengeance but through the quiet, relentless choice to remain human when the world insisted you could be something less.